Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Wrong Men. And I think, did I say The Wrong Men? Well, I meant, of course, The Raw Men. And today we have Fadi Riyad of Egyptian descent, he says, but living in Melbourne, Australia. He is the author of a book called The Gospel of Lie. The premise being, if I understood this correctly, the way that Christians recite the Bible, but not actually what it really says. Am I following the gist of it correctly?
It's a way to emulate the evangelist approach to the Old Testament. So I didn't write the book on my own. There's also another author, and it was basically his idea, even though I took where he stopped. And he wrote a book first, and in that book he tried to describe how the evangelists, that's the writers of the four Gospels, have misquoted the Old Testament to prove that Jesus was the Messiah. And in this book, he goes further. He decides to study their approach to the Old Testament and apply it to the four Gospels themselves, to deliberately misinterpret the four Gospels. And it starts a new religion, basically. And things just spiraled out of control after that. When we both started to get so washed up in our interpretations of it that we started to think, well, maybe we're really discovering something real out there. You know?
Well, I wouldn't think that you'd have to, intentionally misinterpret the Bible, because I mean, as I understand, there's like 30,000 different Christian denominations, all of which are like earnestly trying to interpret the Bible in some way, and yet they come up with all these bizarre interpretations. I recently interviewed somebody that said that according to his interpretation, Adam was the serpent.
Just when I saw that, I've heard everything. Well, something new.
Exactly. So what did you come across? I mean, and I don't want. I want to hear about how you guys misinterpreted the Bible or the Gospels on purpose, but I'm sure there's some comedic effect in there. But initially, I'm more interested in how evangelicals misinterpret the Old Testament.
Well, Joshua Lai, who first started writing this book, his real name is George. He was just using the pen name of Joshua Lai. He was not a mysticist in the sense that he did believe that there was a man who lived called Jesus. And of course, after his crucifixion, after his death, you had a bunch of his followers who had to prove that he was the Messiah. And they had to selectively read the Old Testament, pick certain snippets, and whether try to find explanations of things that he really did, or to try to insert some fictional details into his life to mirror or to echo some verses from the Old Testament. And through this way, they have crafted a quite believable Jesus. I mean, let's have a look here. Let's see what they really say. I mean, there you go. He was born in Bethlehem, just as Micah predicted, Micah 5:2. He was born to a virgin, like in Isaiah 7:14. He was descended of.
Wait.
Everything. Yeah.
I gotta jump in here for a moment, because this is one of my pet ones, where they say that I think it's Matthew cites, where Matthew makes reference to Isaiah, and it talks about that Jesus was the fulfillment of this prophecy. But if you read Isaiah 7:14, it couldn't possibly be talking about Jesus.
Yeah, of course. But that's the point. They have misinterpreted. I'm just trying to show you the Christian stance, what they would say. But it's not that I believe in this. Yeah.
All right, go ahead. I'm sorry to jump in.
No, that's fine. So what's happening here is that you have them. If you read what they say, it would make perfect sense to the layman who is not very well versed in scriptures. And let's be honest, how many people out there would really go open the references in the Old Testament and see what the text really said? Well, not really a lot. So for the average guy, he would say, yeah, I mean, it does make sense. He worked miracles. He was crucified just in Isaiah 53. He fulfilled the words of Jeremiah for being a descendant of King David. He will find everything there on a superficial level. But if you dig deeper,
retroactively written, I mean, it was, the Gospels were designed to fit all of these. Well, that's your point, though.
most of them, not all of them. I mean, the idea of the crucifixion was not something that the evangelists, that the writers of the Gospels have designed. It was something that really happened, and that was probably one of the most difficult things to prove, that the Messiah was going to be crucified, because this idea has no place in the Jewish thought, as any rabbi would say.
Yeah, as I understand it from the Jewish perception of the Messiah, is that the Messiah has no magic powers, that he's, other than his immortality, that he was supposed to be a military commander, and that he can't be killed.
Exactly. Probably the closest person in history who fulfills the idea of a Messiah, or who came close to it, is a guy called Shimon Bar Kokhba, or Bar Kokhba. He led the second revolt against the Romans, and he did establish Israel. He did establish a kingdom, and a lot of the Jews living at his time saw that he was really the Messiah, because he did what the Messiah was going to do. He established a kingdom. That's something that Jesus didn't do. Eventually, he was crushed. Eventually, he was defeated, and he was murdered. I think the Romans threw him to the lions or something, in the Colosseum. But for the time where he lived, he came much closer to the original concept of a Messiah, than other messiahs in history.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when I talk to the evangelicals, and they always want to point out, as if this is a common knowledge somehow, all the fulfilled prophecies of the Bible. And I have a tendency to say, okay, show me one. And almost invariably, it's Isaiah 7:14 is the first thing that comes up. And then I have to say, did you read it? Let's go back and read it. And of course, they can't interpret that to be talking about Jesus by any stretch. And then when they talk about, how Jesus was prophesied to be the Messiah of the Jews, and he's the fulfillment of that. Okay, well, let's go back and look at that. The military commander, he was supposed to, rebuild the temple. He was supposed to unify the kingdom. He's immortal. And again, they don't. There's a lot of confirmation bias in this, but I'm going to let you go ahead and give other examples, or finish that one.
Yeah, sure. There are two different kinds of prophecies. Let's say there are things that did really happen in the life of Jesus that the writers of the Gospels had to prove were fulfillment of certain prophecies in the Old Testament. So in this case, they would take innocuous verses of the Old Testament and try to pretend that these were prophecies, and say, all right, Jesus fulfilled these. Probably the most famous of these is something like Isaiah, the 53rd chapter of Isaiah. You have him saying, he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. By his bruises we are healed. These are things in the Old Testament. They do sound perfectly like what happened to Jesus, what really happened to Jesus on the cross. I personally believe that Jesus was really crucified. But the only issue is that these are not prophecies. They're not Messianic prophecies, as any rabbi would realize. On the other hand, there are fictional elements introduced to the life of Jesus to echo with some verses from the Old Testament, which may indeed be prophecies or may not even be prophecies. Let me give you an example. In the 22nd Psalm, it says, they divide my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots. Now, this is in the Old Testament. It's not really a Messianic prophecy, as the average Jewish person would know, but the evangelists added this to the crucifixion of Jesus. So Jesus was crucified, but it's highly unlikely that the Roman soldiers took interest in his clothes. So this is one fictional element introduced into an actual event just to echo or to resound with that verse from the Old Testament. And I might get to an interesting point, maybe a little bit too early, is that these manipulations have introduced a lot of problems in the Gospels. And let's take this case, for instance, when they say that the Roman soldiers have divided the clothes of Jesus among them. What would that mean? It would mean that his clothes were precious. But doesn't that violate the whole concept of Jesus being very poor, of Jesus being a man who didn't have a place to lay his head? So you see, when the evangelists try to pepper events, they end up with inconsistencies in the Gospels because they did have agendas. Let me give you another example. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" But that wouldn't make much sense with him being God. Why did the Gospel of Mark put this verse there? He put it there because it's present in the 22nd Psalm. So he's putting it there to resound with the Old Testament, but he ends up with a problem in his Gospel. And these Gospel problems are a gold mine if you want to misinterpret the Gospels themselves, which is a major argument about this book. This book is not just to expose the Old Testament, how the evangelists misquoted the Old Testament, but it's a deliberate misreading of the New Testament. The best way to misinterpret a text is to capitalize on the things that don't make sense and try to provide your own answers. If there is something that doesn't make sense to the average Christian, and he just believes in it, and then I come to him with a new interpretation of the gospel, and I tell him, you know what? Look at this verse. It never made sense to you. Well, it makes sense in my new interpretation. It's because this and that. And I give him an interpretation. It immediately starts to sink in. And this is basically how this book is constructed. It tries to pinpoint all of these biblical weaknesses and offer shocking and strange interpretations. And at the end of the day, things start to make sense, even though it's just a deliberate game, you know?
If we were talking about people who thought about things scientifically, if you read these passages and you think that, well, I think this means this, I think this is what this is really saying. Okay, so you have your own little unique interpretation. The way that religious-minded people are taught to interpret the Bible is that this is God speaking through them. And so they think that whatever interpretation they've got is God-breathed. Their interpretation came from God. And so if you try to give a different interpretation, you were conflicting with what God told them.
Yeah,
this is what I usually hear. And then I hear the excuse about prophetic language. Like in one case, which fortunately was recorded, and I put it up on my channel, I argued with this one guy about this Isaiah 7:14 thing. And I want to go through the steps to prove that what they were talking about there could not possibly be talking about Jesus. I was told that it can mean, it can be talking about a child that lived 700 years before Jesus, and it could also be talking about Jesus too, even though there's no correlation and the two don't make any sense. You can have them mean both because it's prophetic language. Well, why is it prophetic language? It's prophetic language because they have an interpretation. They want to assume that God is talking to them, and this is what God is saying. So they're going to believe what they want to believe, and it doesn't matter what the evidence is.
Yeah, that's well, yeah, that's quite obvious. That's exactly what's happening. When they do have an interpretation, they go for it. And there are a lot of verses from the Old Testament that serve no particular purpose in Christianity, and thus they're just being ignored.
Do you have any examples that you'd like to illustrate?
Well, I would like to talk a little bit about misinterpretations and how they can arise. I mean, our book is about misinterpretations, deliberate misinterpretations. It's a game, you know. But there are instances in the past when there were religious people who had to misinterpret texts for a number of reasons. One of these reasons is to make sense of the text. Let me give you an example. This one is not perpetuated by the Christians, but by the Jews. In the first chapter of Genesis, it says that God created man, like humans, man and woman. And then in chapter 2, it says God created Adam, then Adam was alone, and then God decided that it was not good for Adam to be alone, so he created a wife for him. He took the rib and he created Eve. So you have two contradictory stories here. We now know that these two stories are contradictory because they come from two different sources. That the book of Genesis was not written by Moses, and most importantly, it was not written by one man. I mean, if you would ask a biblical scholar, he would show you 5 or 6 verses and tell you this come from that source. However, the next verses come from a different source. So you can have inconsistencies even in the same chapter, because the same chapter was not written by one author, but by 2, who may have lived many years apart in 2 different places and had 2 different ideas about the divine.
To help out the audience.
So in the case,
to help out with the audience with this, what you're
yeah,
talking
yeah,
about,
yeah. So
there was one myth, and I think it's the Epic of Atrahasis, so I may have it confused with something else, where you have a collection of gods and they make 7 figurines for males and 7 figurines for females. Male and female, they created them, let us make man in our image. And it was the 6th divine generation that created man so that the 7th generation could rest.
Mm-hmm.
And so we get these elements and then later you get this other story of Adama in one representation, also known as Adapa in another, where he is given the food of life by the gods, and he's told to refuse it because he's under the suspicion that they would poison him. So these are like some of the many original myths that contributed into that. I'm just filling in the backstory behind what you're saying.
Yeah. So, which is perfectly fine, but obviously the Jewish person who would read Genesis, he would have no idea about these background stories. And he is left with what the text tells him today. Genesis 1 says Adam and Eve were created together. Genesis 2 says Adam was alone and then God had to create Eve. So they would have to misinterpret the text to solve this inconsistency. And this led them to believe that the woman mentioned in Genesis 1 was not Eve, but another woman. Her name is Lilith, of course, definitely. So they said,
I was hoping you would bring her up.
Yeah. So God created Adam and Lilith, and then Lilith abandoned Adam. So Adam became alone. So God had to create Eve.
And then Lilith comes back in the form of the serpent. Yeah. And this is why all of the Christian art of the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance, with I think one exception, all of the Christian paintings at the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and the front entrance of Notre Dame Cathedral, the mainstream, the church at that time represented the serpent as a woman.
Yeah.
And people don't pay attention to that. How do you overlook that?
The ceiling it's very beautiful.
That's a pretty dramatic representation for you to not notice that. Of course. That the serpent is a woman. And so that's my favorite deliberate misinterpretation that the Christians make. It's the serpent is Satan thing. We're like, okay, well, where does the Bible say that the serpent is Satan? I'm expecting that they're going to give me a source out of Genesis, which, let's try to have a little consistency. If we want to assume that one man wrote Genesis and one man wrote some other book, but you can't go to a reference from the very last book to talk about the very first book, because, one was, according to their belief system, one was written, 5,000 years ago, and then one was written after the time of Jesus. So
exactly.
If they want to go to Revelations and they say, well, it says that serpent is Satan is that old serpent. Yeah, it says it's that old serpent with 7 heads who's standing on the beach. So what was he supposed to crawl on his belly for all of his days, and yet he's standing on the beach? What is that about? But yeah, there's another deliberate misinterpretation. Go ahead.
But the important thing is that the Jews welcomed the story of Lilith, even though it had negative theological implications. Why would God create Lilith if he knew firsthand that she would leave Adam? But they still liked the idea because it made sense of the scripture. Let's think of another example. This time, well, I was going to have another one in mind, but let's go for the one that you talked about yourself. The serpent with the 7 heads. I didn't really think of it now, but when you mentioned it, I said, well, yeah, that's another misinterpretation. When the book of Revelation was written, Rome was pagan. And of course, you know that Rome is built over 7 hills. So the serpent with the 7 hills represent pagan Rome that is led by the Emperor Nero, who is persecuting Christians. So at least in my own opinion, that was the original interpretation of the book of Genesis. It condemns pagan Rome that is killing the Christians. But let's look at what the Protestants today are saying. The Protestants, fundamentalist Protestants who hate the Catholics, they're saying, oh, the serpent stands for the 7 hills on which Rome is built, and consequently the whore of Babylon is the Catholic Church. The Antichrist is the Pope. So you see, they're misinterpreting it to serve their own sectarian purpose of being anti-Catholic. So that's another misinterpretation. Let's look at another biblical consistency that also led to a misinterpretation. In the Gospels of Luke and Matthew, especially in the Gospel of Matthew, you have John the Baptist baptize Jesus, and from the baptism narrative, it becomes perfectly clear that he recognizes the nature of Jesus. He knows who Jesus was. And then later, John is imprisoned, and while in prison, he sends 2 messengers to Jesus to ask him if he was the one. That wouldn't make much sense. You've already baptized him. You know that he is the Christ. So why send another 2 different messengers? The real explanation, as far as I believe, is that because these 2 stories came from 2 different sources. So you always have the same writer copying from more than one source and not recognizing the inconsistencies that result from relying on more than one source. In this case, the baptism narrative comes from Mark, whereas the story of the 2 messengers come from the document Q. But in the end of the day, regardless of how these 2 stories came to be together, this represented an inconsistency to the Christians.
I'm sorry, you threw me off with something. The document Q, is that connected to the Wellhausen hypothesis, or am I getting something confused? Getting something confused. It is.
No, you're right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the Q document hypothesis. Yes, that's right. So you have John the Baptist baptize Jesus, and then eventually not recognizing who he was and sending messengers to ask him if he is the one. And this is an inconsistency. Let's see how one of the Christian saints, Saint Gregory the Great, how he made sense of it. He said, all right, look, John always knew who Jesus was, but when he was imprisoned, he realized that he would soon be martyred, and he wanted his own disciples to start following Jesus once he was dead. So he sent them to Jesus so they would see the miracles that Jesus is performing and then believe in him. So basically, instead of just telling them, once I die, go and follow Jesus, no, he wants them to see firsthand the kind of miracles that Jesus is doing. That's why he pretends not to know who Jesus was and tells them, go and ask him if he is the one. So it's a very convoluted interpretation. And it supposes the existence of a backstory. And for what? Just to make sense of Scripture. So,
okay, I got one for you. This is a favorite of mine. Were you done with that one? I didn't cut you off, right? Were you? Okay. One of my favorites is and this is something that I get from believers who believe in the whole young Earth thing, right? They think that the Earth is only a few thousand years old, and they say that Jesus split time. Well, how did Jesus split time? Well, because he was born in the middle time. He there was 3,000 years before him was the origin of time, and then there was birth, and then 2,000-3,000 years after that. But what they're failing to understand is that Jesus was not born in the year 0. There was never a year 0. At the time that Jesus was born, the people of that time did not consider it the year 0. They considered it the year, I think, 45 on the Julian calendar, and then it was 1500 something. AD or CE, when you have a Pope, Gregorius, I think, who decided to retroactively impose his calendar on the birth of Jesus. And he knew that Jesus was supposed to have been born between the time of Herod and the census of Quirinius, and these are 10 years apart. So he literally just selected a date between them, called that 0, and started his calendar from there. And this is what people are talking about when they say that Jesus split. No, no, this is a deliberate misinterpretation, right? Forcibly imposed by the Pope. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. The only thing the only date that we would probably know about the life of Jesus is that he was crucified before the year 36 AD, as in with our new calendar, because after that date, Pilate was no longer in charge. He was removed from office. So if he was really crucified under Pilate, then he must have been crucified maximum at the year 36. Yeah. So the story of this book is we're deliberately trying to misinterpret the New Testament to show how a new religion could be based on Scripture, on old Scripture. A couple of days ago, I did something that probably everybody would do, and I Googled the book to see if anybody is talking about it. And it has already been mentioned once in the Mormon discussion forums. Probably an ex-Mormon has decided to show his fellow Mormons how Adam Smith, the founder of Mormonism, could misinterpret the Bible. Yeah, which he did Smith. Big time. Sorry, I apologize, Joseph Smith. So
okay.
So yeah, which he did big time. And because he wanted to tell them, guys, look, there's a book there that shows you how an imposture of such a magnitude can be pulled off. So I was glad that some people are, noticing it.
I would have been curious. I mean, if I was in the 1800s and Joseph Smith shows me what he's supposedly copied down from these golden tablets, I would want to know, why is he using what was it? Middle Ages Queen's English. you're using language from the 1600s. Why? Why would they be doing that?
Probably just for the psychological effect of giving you the feeling of antiquity.
Oh yeah. But if you're not supposed to recognize that you're being defrauded, then you're not supposed to recognize that, right?
Of course. So, in order to duplicate what the evangelists did to the Old Testament, this part is the part written by Joshua, not by myself. So he decided to see what they did to the Old Testament in order to duplicate it and apply it to their own scriptures. So he found out that they didn't really change the text of the Old Testament. There are very few instances when one of the evangelists says that the Gospel of Jeremiah says something that it doesn't say, or that he confuses the book of Jeremiah for the book of Zechariah. But there are very few cases. In most of the cases, if you go back to the Old Testament, you will find indeed the texts that the New Testament is talking about. In most of the cases, not all of them. So they didn't change the text of the Old Testament. However, they have changed the interpretation of it. They have deliberately misread it. And they have also advanced a concept that is alien to Judaism, a concept of a divine being who becomes incarnated and who has to save humanity from the sin of Adam. All of these ideas are new ideas that don't have a place in Judaism. So he decided that he would do the same thing to the Gospels. He will not claim that any one of the Gospels said something that it didn't say. He will not insert any fictional verses in the Testament itself and then say, oh, look, as it said here. No. And however, he will misinterpret the New Testament on purpose, and he will do that to advance a very bizarre idea of Jesus that Christians today would find totally bizarre. Yet he will do all of these things with in the most convincing way possible. So these were the 4 rules that he decided to follow in his book. Of course, in order to misinterpret the New Testament, you have to misinterpret it to mean something else. I mean, you have to misinterpret it. You can't read the New Testament and say that Jesus was the Son of God. That's not a misinterpretation. That's what the Christians would believe is indeed the message. So if you want to misinterpret it, you have to advance a new idea, a new concept of Jesus, maybe to prove that he was an alien, or to prove that he was a time traveler from the future. But he didn't do that. He decided to settle on an ancient religion known as Gnosticism. So the Gnostics were a 2nd century Christians who did accept most of the books that eventually made it to the New Testament, but they had totally different concepts of Jesus than the ones held by Christians today. And like any good believer, they wanted to show that the New Testament advances their ideas, that the New Testament advances the idea of a Gnostic Jesus. And consequently, the Gnostic interpretation or exegesis of the New Testament fulfills all the requirements for Joshua. They accept the scriptures, they deliberately misinterpret it, they misinterpret it to serve very bizarre beliefs. The Gnostic Christ is a very bizarre Christ to the average Christian today, and we'll get to that later. And they had to be as convincing as possible to win new converts to their religion and to fight against orthodoxy. So Joshua decided that he will adopt the Gnostic Jesus and then even do more work, see where the Gnostics, what the Gnostics did in the 2nd century, and then even build on it, make their hypothesis even stronger, and involve scripture even more. And what he did was quite convincing to a certain degree, that by the end of his book, I was uncertain whether he was still playing a game of misinterpreting the Gospels, or did he really start to believe that Jesus was a Gnostic God? You know,
there's a fine line there.
Exactly. You're talking about Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, and there is a debate.
That's exactly
what I'm
thinking of.
Yeah, and there is still a debate till today. Did he make a scam, or did he really believe in Scientology? People don't know till today. Some people are saying, no, he really believed. If he was just after some money, I mean, once he made $10-20 million, and he made millions. Once he made 10-20 millions, he could retire to a tropical island or something, you know, and just enjoy the money. But no, he stayed there for the last day. Was he really a believer? Is it a requirement for you to become a good illusionist, to work your illusions on yourself before convincing others? You know,
in some religious perspectives, I think that is. You know, I'm getting an echo there. That we didn't have at the beginning of the show. Did you turn your volume up?
Sorry?
Did you turn your volume up since we started talking?
No, I didn't do anything.
Okay, well, for whatever reason, I'm echoing, so I'm going to have to. I'll not talk very much. But what I was going to say about Ron Hubbard, he made a famous quote where he said, "If you want to get really rich, invent a religion." So that would imply that he didn't really believe it.
Yeah, he started his life as a science fiction writer, and then he said, "I'm gonna make a religion to make me rich. I'm really sick and tired of writing stories for 5 cents a word or something." Yeah. Anyway, going back to the book, in order for me to show how Joshua misinterpreted scriptures, I would have to first introduce Gnosticism a little bit. Are you happy with that?
Oh, yes, please.
All right.
Do you have some headphones you can maybe put in so they don't echo?
Yeah, I can grab these. Do you want to give me a moment?
Sure.
Is it fine for me to hang, or?
Sure.
Okay.
What do you mean hang? Oh, he meant hang up. Okay. Awkward silence of me trying to carry the show without a guest. As far as the deliberate misinterpretations that he's talking about, I've obviously seen a number of examples of that with a number of Christians who wanting to place, why is it that there are 30,000 different denominations, as almost as many by one count as there are individual Christians? That everybody has their own individual interpretation of everything, and people will point out, this happens frequently, when people point out what the Bible says somewhere in the Bible. Okay, well, I don't think it says that. Show me where it says that. Of course, they never can. And then when I say what the Bible actually does say, they say, well, it doesn't say that. Well, yeah, it does. Let me show you, because I can show you where it says that. And then they come up with some excuse, including running out of the room to prevent me from showing them where the Bible actually says that. Or that the Bible will say something that, they say that it can't possibly mean, like in Numbers 5, when it talks about performing an abortion. Well, they insist, well, that the woman wasn't pregnant. It doesn't mean that that the baby, that she had a baby, and that her womb would discharge. Well, that's actually exactly what the scripture says, that her womb would discharge. Well, that just means she would be barren and wouldn't be able to get pregnant. No, what if she was already pregnant? And there's an impasse there. Certain people can't allow themselves to interpret what the thing actually says. There's another example in the actual Ten Commandments. The actual Ten Commandments are in Exodus 34. And in that one, the fourth commandment, for example, is that everybody's supposed to bring their firstborn child to be sacrificed unto me. And you may redeem your child with a goat or with a sheep or something like that. But otherwise, nobody comes out empty-handed. And there's references in I think it's Ezekiel, where they say that that people were. He laments that people were actually doing this. Okay, and our guest is back.
Hello.
Yep, I hear you fine. Thank you so much for doing that. Because that echo can be maddening when you're listening to a podcast later on.
Sure.
So, what did you want to bring up next?
So now, in order to discuss how Joshua misinterpreted scriptures, we'll have to see, he has to misinterpret it to mean something else. Obviously, that thing was Gnosticism in his case. So before I can do that, I will just have to give a very simple idea about what Gnosticism is. All right, so the Gnostics believed in one divine transcendent being, and they believed in a lot of emanations, Plato style, like emanations of divine beings who radiate forwards from that one source. And they believed that some of these were male, some of these were female, and there were structures in the form of couples. The last of these couple were Sophia, who is a female aeon, or that is the divine being, and her consort, who is known as Celatus. And we can just say that his name was Christ, basically. So Sophia decides that she will have to create something of her own. So she leaves her partner, she makes a mistake, and she creates a being on her own will. And this being is probably quite famous. He is known as the Demiurge. And he's probably one of the most famous characters in Gnosticism. The Demiurge then turns against his own mother, that is Sophia. He abducts her, he dismembers her, and he imprisons the spiritual matter, her spiritual matter, into the material world, which comes to be the world that we live in. Of course, the Gnostic myths varied widely from one sect to the other, but this is the basic skeleton that I would just have to say in order to explain the book now. So, according to the Gnostics, Jesus was the Christ. He was the partner of Sophia. And after she was abducted, after she was made prisoner into the earth, he had to descend to the earth to save her and to bring her back to the heavenly realm where she came from.
Oh, wait. No, and so this is a parallel of Hercules and Alcestis.
Some people argue that Gnosticism has a background in pagan philosophy. As far as I understand today, most scholars agree that it is of Jewish origin. They say that if you examine the Gnostic texts, they quote the Old Testament big time, that they could have only been written by people who are really acquainted with the Old Testament, that is Jews. They believe that some Jews who are disillusioned with their God, that we would today call Jehovah, after all the military defeats, especially after the second war with the Romans, they decided that they're no longer going to believe in Jehovah. and they equated Jehovah with a demiurge. So it's just born out of this illusion with the Jewish God who could not save his people for so many wars and so many exiles and times. So just by saying this minor thing about Gnosticism, just by illustrating the very basic skeleton about it, you can already see that it's quite alien from Christianity today. Nice puppy. Oh, he bites. Watch out.
He came up here just to fight with me.
That's all right.
Sorry to disturb you. I will put him back.
No, that's fine. That's fine. What's the name?
This is Bowie.
Bowie.
Yeah, his name is Bowie because one of his eyes is a different color than the other, and he's blonde.
That's fine.
Okay.
That's all right. So just by saying these very brief things about Gnosticism, it becomes immediately apparent that it has nothing to do with Christianity today, and that it would be quite blasphemous to the average Christian today to see how the Gospel of John or how the Gospel of Mark is being misinterpreted to serve the purpose that Jesus was a divine being who came in earth to save his lover, you know? And
don't they also argue that Jesus had no physical form?
Some of them did, yeah. This belief is known as Docetism. The belief that Jesus didn't have Docetism.
Okay.
Or the Docetists, yeah. It's just a noun. Docetism is a noun. The Docetists are the people who adopted it. Okay. Some of them were Gnostics, some of them were not. But this idea was, not sure about the Ebionites, really. Probably the followers of Marcion.
I was told that the conflict was that the Ebionites believed that Jesus was just a man. They're basically Jews for Jesus, kind of, where they believe that Jesus was just a man. He's just a physical being with no divinity to him, and that the Gnostics believed that he was entirely divine and that he didn't actually have a physical form, that was just an illusion.
Yes, that's right. It's quite interesting to find that there were groups that shared ideas from both of these. There was one teacher known as Cerinthus. Cerinthus was a Gnostic in the sense that he believed that the God of the Old Testament was only the demiurge and not the final spiritual authority. However, on the other hand, Cerinthus accepted the Jewish scriptures and he accepted the Jewish law. And even Christians today don't accept the Jewish law. They don't eat kosher food. They don't rest on the Sabbath. But Cerinthus, despite being a Gnostic in the sense that he didn't believe that Jehovah was the ultimate God, he still ordered his followers to accept the Jewish law. So it just gives you an idea of how diverse Christianity was in the first centuries. Anyway, so going back to the Gnostic myth, you will find that it fulfills all the rules of Joshua Lai. The Gnostics accepted the books that made it to the Bible, eventually to the New Testament. They had to misinterpret them, of course, if you're going to prove that Jesus was a divine being who was interested in saving a woman called Sophia or a goddess known as Sophia. Then you will have to rework everything in the Bible to fit this idea. Their ideas were definitely blasphemous to Christians because they're so different, and they did their best to prove that this was the case. So Joshua Lai found out that this was the perfect candidate for his misinterpretation. So he adopts the Gnostic stance, and he starts to misinterpret the whole Gospels to serve this idea. And he, as I mentioned before, he would always pinpoint weaknesses in the Bible, things that don't make sense to the average Christian, and then he would introduce his own explanations. And if you're an average Christian, you don't, there is always this phrase that doesn't make much sense when you read it, and you never really knew what it meant. And then you have someone coming with a new religion, and he's giving you a very bizarre explanation, but it finally makes sense. Then you will start to think twice, and maybe it will start to sink in.
Do you let me give you one example? Because
of course. I will tell you one example. In the Gospel of John, unlike all the other three Gospels, talks about signs that Jesus did. And it even enumerates these signs. The first of these signs is very famous. Jesus and Mary are attending a wedding in Cana, And then they run out of wine. And Mary tells Jesus they don't have wine. Do something. And then he gets quite angry and tells her woman. He calls her woman, which is quite rude, you know. Woman.
This is his mother.
It's not my time yet. Yeah, it's not his time. He goes, woman. Why is he doing that? She's just simply asking him to help. Eventually, he does help. But the average Christian, just ask the average Christian, why was he so angry? Why was he angry to the point of being rude to his mother and calling her woman? But then Joshua Lai finds it perfectly clear. The message or the mission of Jesus is to save Sophia. So his message, his mission is one of spiritual wedding. So by performing his first sign in a wedding, he is unwillingly giving a clue to the secret purpose of his incarnation. You see?
Okay, and this is the deliberate interpretation or the deliberate?
Yes.
Okay, got it. Because I wasn't sure how many denominations already bought into that. One of the things that any Christian that's listening should understand is that when you talk about the diversity of the early Christian church, when they got into like the 3rd and 4th centuries, when they finally started putting the different groups together, because they were wildly diverse before that. In the 2nd century, you had the Coptic Gospels. You being Egyptian, of course, you're familiar with those, and you had the people like I think it's I can't remember his name now, but one of the fathers in the church fathers in the 2nd century that was saying that it was telling people to remember the stories about Jesus, where he was just like Hercules, with his feats of strength and all of this, and that and where are the stories about Jesus and his feats of strength? We don't have those, because there was all these gospels that didn't make canon. There's the gospel of Thomas. There's a gospel where Jesus kills somebody's child because he gets angry. There's a handful of these that never made canon. And then there's others we've never read, where we have like Jesus's acts, feats of Herculean strength and so forth. Where did that come from? But Justin Martyr was aware of them, in the 2nd century. Well, I would like to read some of that stuff from the 2nd century, but the problem is that when you got into, like, I think it was about 361 when they started finally putting together canon, and they said, okay, well, this is going to be the accepted word of God, and then anything else that talks about Jesus that isn't part of this will have to be destroyed, and anybody that has these books will have to be criminalized. And that's why we can't read any of these other stories about Jesus, all written by people, by the way. And
it is a common misconception that the New Testament was placed or was accepted in the Council of Nicaea. As far as I understand, it was only accepted when Athanasius, who was the Pope of Alexandria at the time, issued a letter enumerating the 27 books that eventually made it to the New Testament. And from that time, the church started to enforce only these books. It was around that time that some monks probably hid the texts, the Coptic texts, the Gnostic texts, that would eventually be discovered in 1945 in Nag Hammadi, which are known now as the Nag Hammadi Library.
People need
I'm not really sure about
the Coptic Gospels that you're talking about are much older than a lot of Christians want to realize. I mean, that these could be concordant with the Gospel of John. I think that old.
As far as I understand, the Gnostic Gospels were written in the 2nd century. In the past, like 20 or 30 years ago, you had some scholars agreeing that Gnosticism predated Christianity. However, as far as I understand, I'm not a scholar myself, but as far as I understand, the consensus today is being that Gnosticism is a 2nd century development within Christianity. Valentinus, who was one of the most prominent Gnostic teachers, claimed to be a disciple of Paul. So he said that he was just 2 generations separated from Paul, and obviously he was teaching that Paul himself was a Gnostic. As to Jesus being of Herculean strength, I've never heard of that before. It only reminds me, that's a new one. It only reminds me of the Gospel of Peter, where Mary Magdalene witnesses the resurrection of Jesus. She sees Jesus being helped out of the grave by two angels, but that they are all giants. All three of them are huge. She is so scared. There are three giants coming out of the grave, and behind them, the cross itself comes out of the grave, and the cross starts speaking to heaven, which is extremely bizarre. Of course, I mean, what were these guys thinking when they wrote the Gospel of Peter? But that's the only thing that the story of Jesus being of Herculean strength would remind me of.
Okay, but the Gospel of Peter that you're talking about, that was one of the Gospels that didn't actually make canon. That wasn't one of your contrived misinterpretations.
No. It's
that was someone's actual belief once upon a time.
Yeah. This is a historical gospel, probably written in the 2nd century. It has nothing to do with our story here now.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't know. At this point, would you like me to go ahead and show examples of how we misinterpret scriptures?
Please.
Or would you prefer to talk about Gnosticism? Or
no, please. Yeah, you take command of the interview.
No. So, all right. Maybe I can dive a little bit into the story. I mean, the story of Joshua and how he misinterprets the Bible. So going back to the Gospels, as I mentioned, the first thing is the wedding of Cana, when he's so reluctant to perform a miracle, because this would show that his mission is one of spiritual wedding or mystical wedding. And then Joshua did something else. He started to noticed that Jesus interacts with so many women in the Gospels. And when you're talking about the Gospels, these are things that were written like 2,000 years ago. Women at that time, especially in a poor place like Palestine, they were considered like property. It's like, a man has a slave and he has some sheep and he has a woman. It's just a property of his. However, women are playing such a prominent role in the Gospels. And Joshua immediately says, well, there's a reason to it. All of these women are actually representations of Sophia, that is the female goddess that Jesus is going to save. He notices that the first encounters of Jesus with women are always tense and hostile. You have in the Gospel of Mark, for instance, the first case where Jesus is approached by a woman, and she tells him that her daughter is very sick. And she's a Greek woman. She tells him that her daughter is very sick, and he is very angry. He rebukes her, and he calls her race dogs. This is a woman asking you to help her daughter, and you're calling her dog? Why? This is another example of the things that don't make sense. And Joshua had a radar. Whenever he would see something that doesn't make sense, he would immediately grab hold of it and try to misinterpret it, because he knows that this is the shortest way to make people really buy into his ideas. He also notices that in the Gospel of John, one of the first women that Jesus meets is a Samaritan woman. And she's a sinner. She had 5 husbands, and the man that she's living with now is not her husband. He's just a lover. And Jesus just patronizes her, self-righteously patronizes her. When she tells him that she doesn't have a husband, he says, oh yeah, of course you don't have a husband. You had 5, and the guy you're living with now is not even your husband. Why is he talking to her in this way? So Joshua says, well, there is a reason. These women represent Sophia. Remember that Sophia fell from grace, fell from heaven, because she ventured away from her partner, who was Jesus, who was Christ. So when Christ first descended to earth, he was still angry with her, because she left him back in heaven. And that's why they first encounter each other with such friction and with such hostility. But after that, as the Gospels go on in the narrative, things become better. He starts healing the woman bent double. There's another woman who is bleeding, and he saves her. There is a woman who is taken in adultery, and he forgives her, and he spares her from a stoning that was going to definitely kill her. He saves her from execution, and things start to get better. They start to get along well together one more time. And very shortly before his death, before he was crucified, you have the woman who is crashing into the place where he was staying, and she pours very expensive perfume in his head, and he's quite happy with that behavior. Even when the disciples start attacking her, he defends her and he tells her, no, leave her. She done that for my burial. So he starts to connect all of these incidents to draw a pattern of spiritual reconciliation, which is, of course, a deliberate misunderstanding. It's quite interesting that I pitched the idea of the book to modern Gnostics, and they were quite enthusiastic about it. They actually liked it. They were they were not much interested in the first chapters of the book, where I talk about prophecies and misinterpretations. That's not what they cared about. But these stories, these Gnostic stories, they liked it. And there was only one of them who was probably keen enough to realize the problem in my narrative. He told me, no, we do not misinterpret the Gospels. That's what they're really preaching. So this is probably the only guy who picked up the small problem with my narrative, is that I'm presenting the religion as a deliberate misinterpretation. He told me, no, our gospel is not the gospel of lie. This is really the secrets hidden in the Gospels.
So the Gnostics, these modern Gnostics, are saying that your deliberate interpretation is actually the correct interpretation?
One of them was not happy with me passing their interpretation as a lie or as a deliberate misinterpretation. He does indeed believe that the Gospels do preach a Gnostic theology.
Oh, I don't know how to top that. I was going to mention that the thing that didn't make sense for me as a kid reading the Bible was when I come across the word firmament and any description of the firmament, and I would ask other people, what the hell is this? And nobody could ever tell me what that is. Well, then, later on, of course, I encounter young earth creationists who, rather than accept that the Jewish interpretation of the earth is a flat disk covered by a giant crystal dome with windows in it, and that's what the firmament is, they instead made up this thing where the earth remains round, but you have this ice shell, a sphere of ice around the entire thing, and then all of a sudden that ice melts, it becomes the rain that becomes the flood, and then where the hell the water goes after that, I don't know, but I guess it soaks into the earth like a sponge. Maybe that's it.
That's right.
There's another of those deliberate misinterpretations.
Of course. In the story of the flood in Noah's time, you read that the windows were opened in the firmament. That's why all the water from the flood came from. They came from above. That's why the sky is blue, because you have a lot of water that's above this crystal dome. It's not that there is polarization of light rays and stuff. That's what people believed 4,000 years ago.
It's funny when I show people that that's actually what the Bible says. That never challenges their interpretation of the Bible. Okay, so the Bible says the earth is flat and says it was covered by a crystal dome. It's still the Word of God. How can it be? but they're going to believe what they want to believe. It doesn't matter what reason tells them.
Yeah. It's even more interesting to notice that the science, to call it science, in the Bible changes as you advance forward in time. You have in the first books a lot of phrases that would definitely mean that the writer believes that the earth is flat. But as you go forward, you see it talking about the sphere of the earth. God is seated on the sphere of the earth. So they started to change their ideas. These people who wrote the Gospels were willing to accept science. And there are people today who are not willing to do the same thing. You see?
And it's funny that I've happened across writings of people like in the 5th and 6th century who were still promoting the flat earth thing and talking about how some may speculate that there's the antipodes, the people that are on the other side of the planet, and that why don't they fall off, or if there are people on the other side of the planet, then they would have had to have had their own Jesus, their own other side of the world Jesus.
I think one of the most famous promoters of the flat earth idea was a monk who wrote a book called Topographia Christiana, Christian topography. And he promoted the idea of the earth being just a flat piece of land enclosed in a box. and he had a drawing of Jesus looking over the box, as if the whole earth is just a flat piece of land enclosed in a box. His name, I'm looking it up now, is Cosmas Indiclopiutus. He lived in the 6th century. So
the guy I'm talking about very obviously had an idea of the Earth as being, say, a long playing record. You know, we've got we'll have the disc, and everybody lives on this side of the disc, and then there's a flip side of the disc. So it wasn't a sphere where you could reasonably walk to the other side. He had an idea of an impassable boundary between this half of the Earth and that half. But again, like I said, this is 5th or 6th century, and I was amazed that these are what would be considered at the time scholarly leaders, but this is the kind of thing that they were teaching.
Yeah, this is probably the Carl Sagan of their age in the 6th century.
Please don't say that.
Well,
right. We are coming up.
Who do you think makes?
I'm sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to ask a quick question.
What's that?
Who do you think makes better sense? Do you think it is a Christian today who believes in a flat Earth would make better sense than the liberal Christian who would not accept much of scriptures? Which one of the two would you believe would have more consistency into him?
It's funny that I talk to the gamut of Christians, and I've talked to Christians who say that they don't have a problem with Jesus being fallible because they say he was only human, and they believe that the Bible is just a book. And I'm like, well, what part of you is Christian then? If you don't believe if you don't believe anything in the Bible, if you don't believe Jesus was divine, then why are you wearing the cross and calling yourself Christian? And I think the reason that these people do is because they just don't want to have conflict in their lives, and they don't want to be part of that fun. And if you just, all you have to do is just say you're Christian, and then nobody bothers you. That's pretty much the way it works. And you still maintain your social life and everything. I'm sure that's what that's all about.
Probably cultural Christian.
Yeah. And I've had a number of people who tell me that they're Christian and also admit that they don't believe a word of it. There's a minister a Methodist minister in Austin who identifies as a non-theist. Well, if you don't believe that God even exists, then why are you calling yourself Methodist? Yeah. But we are coming up on the end of an hour, and I want to make sure that you have gotten everything out that you wanted to talk about, and that I haven't talked too much over you. So is there anything else you need to throw out there or plug?
I will quickly, I didn't go much into the misinterpretation itself, but I will quickly go to one thing.
Okay.
It's deliberate misinterpretation. More of it is deliberate misinterpretation, but it might be a little bit interesting. So if you think about the mission of Jesus, of saving Sophia, who is the spiritual element in the earth, then if he does save her on the cross and they ascend from the cross straight to heaven, then it means that the world will end, because there will be no longer spirit to animate matter. And consequently, Jesus always knew that his act of redemption, which was redemption of Sophia, not of humanity, not of Adam's sin, whatever, he always knew that this mission would bring about the end of existence, and that he was tormented by guilt for most of his life, and particularly in his end times. If you see how in the garden, shortly before he was arrested to be executed, how he was praying to the Father, if you pay particular attention to what he was saying, Father, I ask you not to take them from the world, but to deliver them from evil. So he was not afraid of being crucified. He was feeling guilty because his own crucifixion will bring an end to the world. And that's why in the Gospels, he repeatedly said that the end of the world will come in his own generation. And when he talked about the end times, if you look at them, wars, there were wars back in the 1st century, earthquakes, the Gospel of Matthew says that there was an earthquake when Jesus was crucified, that there would be darkness on the earth, that the sun would be dimmed and the moon would be full of blood. Well, there was darkness on the earth when Jesus was crucified. He talked about the sacrilege which will be erected in the holy place, or the abomination of desolation, as some biblical as some Bible versions translate it, well, that was the cross itself. When you're talking about Jesus executed and crucified, this is an abomination. And it's being erected in the holy place. Where was Jesus crucified? He was crucified in Golgotha, which according to the Jewish tradition is a holy place because that's where the skull of Adam was buried in the ground. And even when you hear the words that he said before he was crucified, couldn't you stay awake for 1 hour? Stay awake and pray that you will not fall into temptation. He was not afraid of being crucified. He just wanted the Father to spare the world and not to let the world end with his own crucifixion. He said, daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. And behold, your house will be left desolate. This world will become now dead once I'm crucified. The end of the world will happen at that time. Even when he was being crucified, he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Of course, the question is, all right, if that was going to happen, then why do we still exist till now? There is a small plot twist. There is another event that happened during the crucifixion that we have interpreted as something that has altered the flow of events and has allowed the world to continue to exist. I will not get into that plot twist now. Maybe if someone is interested, they can read the book. But you will find out that our misinterpretations can be quite convincing at a certain time. Even the words that Jesus said on the cross. He was crucified, and then there is this earthquake. The earthquake is triggered because Sophia is coming out of the earth. And then Jesus sees her, and he tells her, why have you forsaken me? He's talking to her, why have you forsaken me? Because in the Gnostic myth, she abandons him in heaven, and that's why she falls from grace. So he is rebuking her, why have you forsaken me? And then when she hears these words, she breaks in tears. And he tells her, no, it is finished. Today, you will be with me in paradise. In your hands, I commit my spirit. So even the things that Jesus said on the cross could be misinterpreted to mean that he was addressing Sophia. It becomes so witty at a certain point that some people would actually fall into it, even though we're repeating it every time, guys, this is a game. We're deliberately making things up. But at a certain point, you will find that, well, I don't know if I'll be quite audacious to say this, but I would say that our deliberate misinterpretation probably makes better sense than a lot of misinterpretations by existing denominations.
And while you might run the risk of creating your own religion, it seems at least one modern Gnostic thought that you would be duplicating theirs.
I'll become a millionaire. I'll become a millionaire just like Ron Hubbard, and I would get into trouble with the tax department.
That's what always happens. All right, Fadi Rayad, I'm going to put a link to your book underneath this page if you'll provide one for me, and if there's any other links that you would like me to include in the description bar, I will. And I'm going to close it up and allow you to say any last thing that you want before we end the show.
I just want to thank you for giving me this opportunity. It was a real pleasure and delight to talk to you, and I like your show. I will be following it from now on. So I've won a new friend. That's probably one of the best things that this book has got to us. It has helped us to make friends with a lot of awesome people just like yourself.
Thank you very much. All right, and I'll say goodnight.